Hello everyone and welcome back to another world building video for the Explorer's Guide to Ravean kind of series. If you've been keeping up, you're going to hear more about this within the other kind of world building series for different nations, but this time we're going to look at the Libet Empire. As I was saying, you've probably heard of them before because they kind of like to stick their thumb in the middle of every other nation's business. And so they're, as opposed to being kind of a collective cooperative group with alliances and other things, international alliance wise, they kind of meddle and take steps and are kind of a nuisance. Powerful, but a nuisance on the world stage. So they're fairly involved in actual just world history for Ravean, seeing as their place in it has been being parts of other nations' stories to some extent. But this time, we're going to look at their story just a little bit to get an idea of exactly what they're like. So, if we're going to look at the map really quickly, kind of tap over here, the Libet Empire is this massive territory here from just south of this mountain range and all the way down along the coast, and then just north of the Serac Wastes here, and then back all the way down. This is a massive amount of territory, rivaling that of even like the Horsehead Peninsula, which is otherwise probably the most physical like land territory of the world in one specific nation. Now, it makes it a little bit more interesting because you have to kind of wonder, well, the Libet Empire has quite a bit of territory and quite a bit of people in theory. And so if they're extremely meddlesome, why are they not necessarily just a massive world power that has taken over, especially from a historical perspective, especially given that we've already talked about how they meddle with the Ravean Empire and the Mistkeep to some extent in their earlier years before they're a fully established nation. And we'll look kind of into that for the world history, but it gets to be a little bit interesting of a dynamic of, well, you know, what's keeping them relatively at bay for things, and we'll explain exactly what that would be. But for now, from a government structure, the Libet Empire is pretty easily classified as a theocracy. They're focused on the worship of a handful of very specifically approved gods and goddesses. They only really have the three, and while they do have a king emperor or a king queen empress, they have this kind of primary focus of like real power into the religious side of things. And so they're very heavily focused on religious power. And so a king emperor kind of serves almost like unofficially at the pleasure of the Hand of the Holy Triad, which is the approved religious leader, the appointed religious leader of this governing structure. And so I have a diagram of exactly how this might work out. But basically is if the King Emperor was going to do something that the High Hand of the Holy Triad is not happy with, then there's a chance that that King Emperor just mysteriously gets killed in the process. And it's kind of a dangerous thing to oppose this extremely powerful figure. And so they typically don't. They typically kind of have their hands tied for the most part. So, I guess, why is it called the Hands of the Holy Triad? Well, the prescribed gods for the Libet Empire are only three gods and goddesses here. There's the Stormbreaker, the Queen of Decay, and the Dark Deceiver. And that sounds a little bit more like being like a cartoon villain. Oh, they worship the Dark Deceiver. You know, oh, they must be the bad guys. But there are very specific reasons as to why. And part of it is because even if it's a worship for a god or goddess, and it may or may not actually follow that god or goddess's actual will or tenets, they use what they do know and what the public knowledge has been of these gods and goddesses to kind of shape how they're able to use and treat the populace and form public opinion in that manner. So, they appreciate and actually worship the Stormbreaker, the Queen of Decay, and the Dark Deceiver. The Stormbreaker, based on all of our other videos, and there are other videos on the channel here if you wanted to look more into these different gods and goddesses, the Stormbreaker is basically a I will send you challenges, I hope you rise to the occasion kind of a vibe. and kind of the we'll fight together and personal growth and all of those kinds of ideals, which is something that from a leadership perspective and a governing perspective for their goals, they can lean on to some extent to shape a population or the populace's general attitude towards challenge. Well, oh God, there's been a record drought and all of these people are starving and there's no food. Oh God, they could go one of two ways. This village could get absolutely furious and demand support, or they could say, oh, well, this is the test that we have been given. And then those who survive are like, oh, we did it. We must have risen to the occasion. We've done what we could and we are stronger for it. And so it's not necessarily the best situation that you should be running a town with from like a leadership perspective. But for them and their goal, it's effective, which works great because they can blame any difficulty on, well, that's a challenge and you must need to rise to that challenge. Otherwise, the Queen of Decay is in part just, look, there is a greater purpose to a death, right? The Queen of Decay's whole vibe is, hey, life is beautiful. And when life ends, it becomes something new. And so even if you're not talking about the specific soul, right, going into an afterlife, you're looking at how, somebody may have died, great grandma Wilkins may have died. And unfortunately, now she's gone. But she will become something new. And she will become something that helps benefit. And so there's almost this transformative ideal within the Libet Empire that says, well, it was their time and they will eventually come back to us. They may come back to us or they may bless us in some way by affording their energy to something else. It may be, oh, this farmer had passed on because, he was struggling this one year. His farm would not grow, couldn't produce anything. But after he died, all of a sudden his land, which he cared so much for, is now massively productive. And, he must have blessed his field and that is able to take care and feed all of us. His energy has suffused the area. And that's kind of the belief that they lean into. Now, the Queen of Decay is a little bit different from that kind of general focus, but they can use her as a figurehead or a symbol of transformation and change and be able to say, look, things might have been really bad. Those that didn't actually stand up to the Stormbreaker's challenge, they will not be gone. We will see them either in, somebody dies and on the same day someone across the continent is born. And they can say, oh, they must have gone somewhere else. We are an eternal people. Or or they could say, well, they've decided to and re-enrich their community in some way, which makes it less of this horrific thing to end up passing on, because you'll be back and you'll be present to some extent, even while you're gone. And that's kind of the belief that they shape these people to have, so that eventually when you do have kind of warriors and soldiers in a time of war, they aren't necessarily afraid to die so much as they're afraid that they cannot remain a part of their community, because their community ends up being extremely important. Now, the Dark Deceiver, even though it sounds a little bit weird for it, is all about making deals, right? That's her whole vibe, is make a deal, be clever. You can earn great things as long as you have have a good, sharp wit. And so, Evil Goddess, because she tends to make deals that are heavily one-sided in her favor, but to some extent, the Libet Empire wants this. If they can support the worship of the Dark Deceiver and inform people's opinions on what they might want from birth, they might have a chance at getting somebody within their community, within their nation, to make some sort of a wish or some sort of a deal. that ultimately enriches them. Somebody, a young peasant boy, might be interested in becoming a soldier one day, and may, based on his worship of the Dark Deceiver, end up being invited to make a deal with her, and in the process becoming somebody that can say, well, I want to become a legendary war hero. I want to have this powerful fighting technique. I want to be a master of arms and everything there. And that kid may grow up with that boon to become the Libet Empire's most powerful general. Something that then, hey, they've been enriched from a government perspective because they have the most powerful general now because they have a deal with the god. It's kind of a how can we cheat, like almost meta, because it's a D&D game, but it's almost a nation saying, how do we get a leg up on everybody else? Well, there's a goddess of deals. Maybe we should get everybody in our territory to try to make a deal. And if we can all make a deal for great fortune or or great power or something, then there's a chance that, you know, when you say, hey, I want great fortune, and all of a sudden somebody has a ton of money, the government's gonna notice and they're gonna say, hey, you think you got some of something and we need that. And then they claim that they were enriching their community, or they just unperson somebody and re-enrich the community and be like, yeah, no, they spent all their money, sucks, and then they like ride off into the sunset full on bandit style with a bag over their shoulder, cackling as they go off. I mean, either way, they win, because this is an extremely domineering presence and it shapes exactly how people are even allowed to think. And so it's almost a nation of people that are kind of brainwashed to some extent into what exactly they should think about different parts of how like the world works. And so they don't necessarily have a real understanding of how other nations work versus what they're told. And so it kind of becomes a what's actually real kind of perspective for them. So these three gods are kind of purpose-built and purpose-filled gods. They are approved for that specific reason. And we'll look into more details about it going forward here. But for now, let's finish kind of the government structure. This is a diagram of the actual, like, figurehead legal side of things. Like, picture, you know, without separation of church and state. If you were to actually separate it, this is the state. So you have, this is the church. This is the high hand of the Holy Triad. This is effectively their highest leadership within this religious structure. This is someone that represents all three branches of this religious official. This is effectively the most powerful person in the Libet Empire. This is more powerful to some extent than the King Emperor or Queen Empress. This is the person that runs the place. And then just below them, they have the specialized high hands of each god. So they have the high hand of the Stormbreaker, high hand of the Queen of Decay, and the high hand of the Dark Deceiver. And these are the individual people that otherwise interpret the will and work with the high hand of the Holy Triad to understand and interpret the will of these three gods. Now, this can be, how do we use this? How do we, make a miracle happen because this town is beginning to doubt? How do we enforce this? Oh, I think we need to do whatever because this is not the way that we want it. So we're going to do this to make it happen. You know, we don't like that this town is, in theory, starting to lose its faith. Therefore, we need to orchestrate a miracle. And we're going to pick what's the god that's best suited for this? I think the Stormbreaker. Bam, okay. We're going to have someone absolutely summon a horrific lightning storm that kills a fifth of the population. And then everybody else can have this miraculous vision that totally re-inspires things. Because from there, they can end up getting people to be like, okay, these are otherwise dissenters. Let's specifically target them. And it ends up becoming kind of a cloak and dagger, kind of sketchy, but also, oh, it was the God's will kind of an argument that ends up being a little bit more damaging, but a really effective strategy for them. Underneath these high hands of each specific god is different regional worship hands. These kind of regional worship hands take whole sections of the world, for like the Libet Empire, and they end up carving out different sections like a county or a jurisdiction and say, well, you're in charge of this entire area. Work with the local leaders for the religious leadership to deal with everything. And so effectively they're larger scale leadership. They are the regional manager versus your location manager. And then the location manager is a local worship shepherd. Now, going from the bottom back up to some extent here, local worship shepherds are the people that you run into that do their sermons, they run the temple, they have all of these other things, they counsel people. But keep in mind, this isn't necessarily like the best situation for someone to be in, because to some extent a local worship shepherd may or may not be like, I find your lack of faith disturbing, and then take legal steps by getting the regional worship hand involved. And there may be eventually a full-on inquisition of a smaller town because of the concerns that somebody may have. And so they would work their way up the chain and back down the chain for orders. And then once they receive the orders, they take those steps. And it becomes an extremely religious and morality-based argument. But it isn't necessarily religious or moral. Not in every case, but it may be. So, kind of continuing on, this whole mess of a flowchart is a difference between the religious, like church part of government, and the like state part of government. Now, the red ones that you can see, kind of this triangle up here, and then individuals along the way, are the religious side of things, the church side of governing, and they tend to be a little bit more specifically powerful versus kind of otherwise powerful. Like, they have power ingrained into their position just because of the gods, because the argument is, well, the gods are the immortals and they are the true authoritative force of this world. What are you going to answer to man? Are you kidding? And so they kind of sit on a different plane of power, but at the same time, in terms of power levels, just so that it's organizable, I put it into this format here. So I'll zoom in so we can read it all just a little bit easier. But we have the high hand of the Holy Triad, which I put just higher than the Emperor or Empress, which is true. And then the high hands of each individual god or goddess is just barely below the Emperor or Empress. Now, this is kind of an indicative feature because the Emperor or Empress can basically, try to struggle against the high hand of one specific god, but they can't really go up against the whole leadership as a whole. So while they're kind of on the same power level loosely, there's a little bit of fluctuation between everything there. But going into kind of the state side of things, there's the Emperor, Empress, or Regent, depending. Maybe the Emperor, Empress dies and leaves a very small young child that is as of yet too young to rule. A Regent steps in to fulfill the role until they are old enough and capable of ruling in their stead. Then, underneath there, you have their regional advisors. Basically, each region within the Libet Empire has its own individual culture that existed before the region was unified into an empire. And so these regional advisors are there to help the Emperor Empress understand the specific cultural histories that are present within there. Even as they've been erased, there is some small, harmless features that are kind of a thing. Maybe one of them exists in a rivery area that typically floods around a certain time of year. And so it is just a culturally acceptable thing to know that you're going to have to leave your home for a section of the year and move up into the upland areas to avoid things. And so having multiple homes that are otherwise relatively vacant is normal, versus in another part of the nation, another part of the empire, it may be it is way too cold outside for that house and structure to be empty. So we're going to need that to be full with people. And so trying to homogenize it across an entire large nation with different demographic groups and different histories that are driven by the world itself makes it more challenging. So a regional advisor is an expert in their region, but also an advisor to the emperor or empress, so that the emperor or empress can go and say, we're going to do this, and then to go and turn to ultimately the religious leadership and say, this is why we're doing this. Can you get on board with this? And as long as it's a good enough reason, it's usually not a problem, right? It might not be in direct conflict with a religious ideal, but as you know, if it is, then what else are they going to do? The religious leadership can force their hand. From there, there's regional lords and local sheriffs, but regional lords are kind of the people that are actually within the region. A regional advisor is from the region and sent to the capital to be in the court of the emperor or empress, representing their region on kind of a national scale. The regional lord is appointed by this regional advisor because they need somebody to help run things back at home. And so this regional lord is in charge of managing the entire region, making sure that things go well, implementing different policies as they arise, becoming aware of them from the larger governing structure from the court, and getting that missive sent down and organizing the implementation of that. Now, the local sheriff is kind of the people that you see in local areas for like each town or everything else, that serves as the higher legal official that implements those laws and says, all right, here's how we're going to see it. This is what we're doing. This is how we're going to punish an offender. This is how we're going to address these things. They're kind of in partnership with local worship shepherds, the legal action, like a court or a judge, as opposed to just kind of somebody that's around. And so a local worship shepherd can lean on a local sheriff to say, hey, I need you to do this. I need you to prosecute somebody. And they can do that. And then from there, local guards masters are in charge of actual formation of military power, which is a little bit more complicated in terms of how exactly they can maintain this power over a much larger area. But for the most part, I mean, local guards are needed just about everywhere. It is a very dangerous world. In a world where dragons fly around and other monsters exist, it's worthwhile to have at the very least some form of militia. And for the most part, a settlement or a city doesn't really have a specific local Minutemen type militia where it's just volunteers of people. These are people that the government has organized and trained, and this is kind of their branch in. And so underneath the local sheriff, different people from within the town may become guards, but they go off to do training, or you know, in a larger city, or they end up doing training in general to some extent and becoming a specific guards master or guardsmen that is trained as an extension of government to be the policing force and be the protective force that the city may need. So, and go back out. It gets a little bit more messy with this different ideal, but let's look at how we got there. Just reading it out here, the Libet Empire kind of declared their territory sovereignty from the Serac Waste in the year 600 PD. Basically, when the world was still relatively new and everyone was under the assumption that the Serac Waste was the cradle of civilization for people, like not just humans, but dwarves, everybody. Everybody came from the Serac Wastes, is the general thought. And so back at 600 PD, after people had spread out across the rest of the world, they said, the Serac Waste is starting to get real close, because at that point the Serac Waste was trying to expand its territory. And so they ended up declaring their sovereignty from the Serac Wastes and expanded across the wilderness towards like the riverlands around their inland Gemlock Sea. Now, this was at this point a smaller individual region that had said, no, 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 we are the Libet. And there was kind of this Libet region that ended up saying, we're not going to be a part of the Serac Wastes, and stood their ground to try to not become, you know, a conglomerate of this growing international power that was going to slowly try to take over the world. And so the Serac Wastes ended up stopping, and they were able to be themselves as their own independent nation. Now, they ended up kind of banded together with other regions and various cultures to form this organization called the Libet Collective. The Libet Collective was officially formed a couple years after that point, so at 602 PD. And they were pushing back against the Serac forces to establish themselves as a relatively powerful player. So they kind of held their own against this growing national force. And then finally, once the Serac Waste stopped, they were the Libet Collective. So in 650 PD, kind of 40, almost 50 years later, the Libet Collective had expanded from their initial Riverlands territory to include a variety of different towns in this newly formed empire. Basically, this individual region went out and they spread out across other regions, uniting them in a relatively bloodless manner by introducing policies and politics to try to get all of these people that what was within this relatively harsh environment, to get them comfortable with being a part of the world. So now, with the Libet Empire ending up being this relatively powerful inter-regional government, they became the Libet Empire officially. This was kind of a Libet Empire that ended up holding their basic initial organization as part of a collective without doing much else. For a little bit, they were relatively, for lack of a better term, pretty chill. They were happy to be a cooperative nation. They were happy to have collective power and representation in this empire, but they ended up kind of wanting more. And so this new Libet Empire began to set its sights on expansion, specifically similarly to how the Serac Wastes had been expanding in kind of the previous century. And so in 756 PD, the Libet Empire saw a chance at expanding into their neighboring territory, the Mistkeep. The Mistkeep at this point was relatively new and struggling with different issues of warlords trying to take over the region. Now, if you remember the video on the Mistkeep at this point is struggling with the fact that the Mistkeep Mining Guild is a company, and people are starting to sprout up around the company and all of its material benefits, but they aren't an official governing structure, and so it's just loose territories and loose civilizations that are cropping up as almost like boom towns around a railroad. But they're ending up kind of springing into existence around this business, and then people are struggling in this power vacuum for control. And so warlords emerged, and they're raiding these settlements, and it's becoming this massive thing that eventually the Mistkeep Mining Guild ending up stepping forward and saying, okay, if somebody needs to fill the power vacuum, we'll do it. And they kind of start to protect the people because it's of interest to them. It's of interest to their business to have people around. And so they ended up doing that. But the Libet Collective, for the Libet Empire at this point, is interested in expanding, and so they look at the struggle that this power vacuum has created and say, I wonder if we couldn't put somebody in that place. And so they begin to, because they know that they're relatively new and small and undeveloped, that they do not have a chance yet at kind of developing themselves into a more military-focused, we're going to hit them hard, battering ram style attack. They're sponsoring warlords with the funds that they do have. And so they sponsor one or two warlords to try to say, well, you know what? If we are going to put somebody in, we're going to put somebody in that's at the very least, considerate and cooperative with us as our empire. and then maybe we can just subtly roll in after the fact. And so didn't end up going their way. And so they end up having the Mistkeep Mining Guild end up kind of repelling these warlords with the aid of a few other international powers. And then they're like, oh crap, that didn't work. And now they've got a number of different people from the Mistkeep upset with them because it was no secret that they were actually sponsoring warlords to try to impose themselves on that territory. And so they're like, oh crap, okay. And so after seeking expansion, they realized that after that failure, they needed to grow in military power. And so they took some time to grow and restructure their society to what it was going to currently be. It was this theocratical structure, which is how this came about. As I said, okay, if we want to get more powerful, we need to do it, and we need to do it right. And over time, because it takes time to completely change a culture, they ended up doing it this way by focusing on a religious power. So they perfected the means and organization during this age of great revelation. Basically, it ran from 800 to 2800, 2890 PD, where over time, they ended up gaining this power and this control over even just their own citizenry. And so they were able to develop a relatively powerful military, and at this point that they had been growing for generations on generations for like 2,000 years. And then they ended up going and trying to say, you know what? There's another territory that isn't well established yet. It's just across the ocean called the Horsehead Peninsula. Let's try to do that. And so the territories of the Horsehead Peninsula were struggling and fighting them as they came across, and eventually, given the support of other nations, specifically the Mistkeep and some of the Serac Wastes, the Horsehead Peninsula territories united and said no and totally repelled them again. So, now the Libet Empire is just about 2 for 2 on their expansion efforts, and they're they're 0 for 2 on the expansion efforts, and they're like, well, crap, what now? And so they're stuck within their territorial boundaries even to this day. But if you've been watching the campaign so far, the Libet Empire has made another play at the Mistkeep at this point, and war has begun. And very curiously, they've been struggling to gain a foothold, and they're starting to, more than ever, get a foothold into the Mistkeep Mining Guild. And so if you were going to be playing within the Ravean campaign setting, you can do something like this, and then depending on how the players choose to interact with that part of the story or what they do, they may or may not be able to allow the Libet Empire to take a step further in and gain control of the Mistkeep and totally dissolve the Mining Guild, or they could repel the Libet Empire and maintain that status quo. Otherwise, some of the more notable times of the year that help inform kind of the general vibe of the Libet Empire, even more so than we've already have been here, are its holidays. Now, these holidays are mainly focused on religious power and control. And so the month of Talus is actually just the month of the Stormbreaker. It has a number of these holidays that recognize specific deities, and that's kind of the trend, is each of their 3 approved gods has a specific month of worship. And it's kind of their month of reflection and worship to that god. And so they end up having the month of the Stormbreaker, where the 9th of the month is called Breaker's Alms Day, and it marks the first day of almsgiving and sacrifice to the Stormbreaker. The people most commonly just make personal sacrifices. Picture like a New Year's resolution. They make a physical personal sacrifice or a behavioral personal sacrifice, and it's just a thing that everybody does. And it doesn't have to be big, but it could be something as simple as a farmer is going to manually till their fields without the aid of livestock. They may make a local pilgrimage to a shrine as an act of service specifically to the god. Then they have, towards the end of the month, the 25th day, is the day of fasting and prayer. Basically, this is called the Breaker's Vigil, and it's a vigil where they take the day to not work. They fast, they pray, and they stay up the entire night praying into the night in worship to the god until the following day, that is the day of the Stormbreaker. And the day of the Stormbreaker is just a day where people celebrate. They remember everything that they have done in the past year. They remember how they have grown. They remember all of the sacrifices that they have made, and they appreciate how far they've come. And this is kind of the catharsis that the entire nation has, is, oh God, this last year was hard. Oh, oh God, 2022. Oh, but then at that point they're like, well, we made it. And then they celebrate. The next month is for the Queen of Decay. Kalemis is the month for the Queen of Decay. And it's kind of, the first is the day of seeding. It's a day when the Libetian people kind of gather all sorts of organic matter, leaves, branches, plants, other compostables, and sacrifice it to the Queen of Decay, specifically lining the landscape with these dried leaves and molding grain that they collect from whatever the previous fall might be, and they keep over the winter, and then they end up spreading it around. And so they line the landscape with dried leaves, and then they bury their sacrifice beneath the dirt or snow, depending on if it's available, to sow the seeds for the Queen of Decay to do her work. Basically, they allow the recognition of this sacrifice, and then they bury the sacrifice to let her work and do what she will with the energy of those things that have moved on. Then they wait pretty much the rest of the entire month, and they have the 28th, which is the day that they visit the graves of their ancestors. They recognize those that led to their own lives and the lives of those deceased people that they did lead before they were gone, and what they may have become, and recognize their newfound connection and return of their essence into the world through the Queen of Decay's power. It's kind of a almost macabre version of a Day of the Dead celebration, where it's not quite the same. But the last day of the month is the Awakening. During this time, the Libetian people, just the day after this celebration of their own personal and their family's histories, they uncover the sacrifices that they made on the day of seeding at the beginning of the month. And they afford their sacrifices the ability to decompose open to the air, showing the power of the Queen of Decay as she has taken over the course of that last month. Taking it as, in part, a sign of her presence within the world, but also affording her and her work glory to the light of day, affording them and everybody visual and remembering exactly what she does, celebrating it on its own, and then eventually being buried once again for the remainder of the year to return that energy and that work to the earth itself. Finally, they have Shantis, the month of the Dark Deceiver. And this gets a little bit more challenging, but the third of Shantis is the day of placement. It's the day when people reflect on the nature of divinity and mortality, and the relationship that the two do have with each other. The people of the Libet Empire also celebrate the Dark Deceiver's divinity, affording sacrifices in her name of money, food, and valuables, just kind of hoping to entice the Deceiver to contact them for a deal. Kind of a, oh yeah, you're so great, I really wish I could just talk to you. Kind of a celebration. So they kind of, it's the day of placement. We recognize our place in the universe, and we recognize that you're really cool, and we really want to butter you up. Kind of a day of celebration. Then they also have the Day of Fools. The Day of Fools is the 5th of the month, and the Libetians celebrate and prove their own wit by just playing pranks. It's like a almost darker version of April Fool's Day. But they play relatively harmless tricks on one another in the name of the Dark Deceiver. These pranks are bolstered by a single day of lawlessness that makes it relatively simple, right? Like, you can steal your neighbor's horse and have it go running off a cliff and be like, gotcha, brah. It's just a prank, bro. And it would that way not be punishable by law. Now, in some portions of the Libet Empire, there are parts of it where it's effectively the purge. Anything more severe than murder is still punishable in very specific cases. And so they have otherwise no legal ramifications, which means that they end up kind of purging each other to some extent on this Day of Fools in some areas of the Empire itself. The last one is the 25th day of Shantis, which is known as the Day of Deals. And over the course of the day, the people of the Libet Empire visit a specific shrine within whatever their local area may be to the Dark Deceiver, place their offerings as well as a note describing their wish as some sort of a purchasing endeavor for favor from this kind of goddess themselves. And then many of them, as they sleep with 2 gold coins on a leather thong around their neck, as an additional bribe should they be reached out to in the middle of the night. This is effectively a please, this is what I want, let's make a deal kind of a holiday. So, in terms of international relationships, as kind of the last thing to cover here, the Libet Empire is relatively involved. We already talked about how the Ramont Empire and the Mistkeep Mining Guild have had some pretty rough dealings with the Libet Empire already. But the Ramont Empire is seen as kind of an enemy of sorts by the Libet Empire. And the Ramont Empire sees the Libet Empire as an untrustworthy enemy or hostile force. And so what exactly are the people within the Libet Empire taught about the rest of the world around them? Because they do have to be relatively sheltered from the rest of the world to make sure that there isn't a wait a minute kind of a conversation that happens from their populace. And so what the people of the Libet Empire know is that they're seen as an enemy, and the Ramont Empire is an enemy. They're seen as a failure within their own expansion efforts, and the reason that they failed is because a group of radical religious fanatics and terrorists acted as this unholy resistance against their righteous evangelical efforts. The Ramont Empire resistances are heretics. They deny the true way and practice amoral, if not dangerous, religious practices. And they see it and its efforts to stop them across their world as a disruptive force bent on persecuting the Libetians for their own religious values. They see the Mistkeep as an age-old rival, a meddlesome but sometimes necessary force, but they end up kind of never really working with them in terms of a trade agreement. So they're this meddlesome supplier for their enemies. They support the heretics within the Ramont Empire. They are still embittered by their failure to expand into the Mistkeep Mining Guild, and then they attempt to kind of keep this relative sort of peace just because they're on the border. But for the most part, they have this attitude that the Mistkeep has an attitude of arrogance and this unyielding entitlement to the world's resources and a lack of respect for the mortal place in the world and in the universe that has made it really difficult to manage and maintain an international relationship. And so they're otherwise hesitant to see the Mistkeep as little more than businessmen with little to no real spiritual connection to the gods or actual enlightenment on their place within the world as mortals. They're a spiritually lacking society of corporate workers. The Surak Wastes are seen as spiritual merchants in the eyes of the Libet Empire. Their relationship with the two nations being not necessarily hostile, but not necessarily friendly, means that they keep a tentative peace with this kind of bordering neighbor, and they do take specific efforts to purchase and work with the Surak Wastes because the Surak Wastes is the oldest civilization in Ravean. The cradle of civilization, the region must be full of different ancient ruins and different goods and relics that people can find. And so mercantile bands that produce these resources or recover these relics and afford research on these ancient times that have been lost to record means that they have this connection to the gods that the Libetians want to know more about. And so the Surak Wastes is a greater military force, but it's also a greater spiritual force, potentially. And so they kind of look at them with a little bit of awe, and they want to understand more, but because they're a different nation, they can't claim to be entitled to the resources without there being an actual war that could break out that the Libet Empire would never win. So they can't press them for resources. The Dauke Kingdom is new. And that's kind of the trend you'll see for everything here. The Doke Kingdom is relatively new, but they're starting to have a good relationship. The Dark Deceiver is a really heavy, prominent factor in the leadership of the Doke Kingdom. And so this fledgling nation has some promise because it has this otherwise similar god, this goddess, the Dark Deceiver, that plays a pretty heavy role within its national interests. And so the Libet Empire says, hey, we like her too. And they're kind of leaning into that common ground to form an alliance and then lean eventually into an opportunity that they see as an easy way to infiltrate and then supplant the leadership that the Doke Kingdom currently has and expand without making too much of a fuss about it. That way they can really quietly assimilate the Doke Kingdom and become the actual rulers. And then looking at the map from where they are, once it finishes loading, the Libet Empire will have the kind of northeastern section of the world and the southwestern arch here, and which is the majority of the territory, making them an extremely powerful player on the world stage. That would make them relatively domineering. And so if they can very quietly infiltrate over time and take control of the government of the Doke Kingdom, they'll be in a more powerful position to try to do that, potentially by force, against the Ramont Empire. And then from there, the Mistkeep, and then finally the Sarak Wastes, gaining control over the world entirely through this one fledgling nation. So they see them as having some hope. They're too new to understand how the world must really work, so they might as well take over. But that's it so far for the Libet Empire. In the next few videos, we're going to look at the different regions and what makes them unique. But until next time, thank you all for watching. Make sure be good to one another, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.